And good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Exploring the Lord of the Rings. This is session number 214. And tonight, we are going to talk about stanza 5 of Bilbo's poem. Who knows? Maybe we'll get frisky and talk about stanzas 5 and 6. I don't know. I would be a little surprised if that ends up happening. But who knows? We'll see. Anyway, before I start tonight, I wanted to announce a couple things. First of all, just to note, many thanks again to all the volunteers who have said they want to be involved in our Exploring the Lord of the Rings web project. I am really looking forward to seeing this. I was seeing that discussions have already begun on our discussion forum. Many thanks to and I've received many emails as well. Jenny's going to be kind of responding to people and directing folks where they need to go, letting folks know the sort of first stages and things. So thanks everybody for your involvement in that. I think it's going to be awesome. There are several ways in which I'm very excited about the Exploring the Lord of the Rings project, and I'll be talking about some more of those in the relatively near future. But anyway, so I just wanted to, if you haven't heard about it or you don't know about it, go to our forums, forums.signumuniversity.org, and you can find the Exploring the Lord of the Rings forums there, and you can navigate through and discover the Legacy Project forums and find out more about it. And you can still easily get involved there. So anyway, the other thing I wanted to draw your attention to, I talked about this on my other broadcasts last week, but I was talking about our web project here, so I didn't get to it last week, but I want to share this with you because this is a new initiative that we are doing at the Mythgard Institute that I think something that really should be of interest to a bunch of people here in this community. So on Mythgard Institute, you click on Mythgard Miscellany, which is the new thing. And Mythgard Miscellany is basically it's designed to be a platform where we can publish cool stuff, like interesting stuff. We want to broaden the voices that are involved in what we do. Like to this point, Mythgard has, you know, the majority, especially if you do it like by hours, right? The vast majority of total Mythgard broadcast hours have been me talking about Tolkien. And that's no shock because I'm the one who started Mythgard and it's what I do. And, but we're wanting to hear from more people about more things, other sort of fandoms and interests that people have, so there are all kinds of things that we're interested in doing. So there are going to be a number of things here. One is starting up the Mythgard Movie Club, which we've already done. So you can see, for instance, that we're going to be doing a discussion of the Amazon Wheel of Time adaptation, which I found fascinating, by the way. So we're going to be talking about that next. So that's the movie club is one thing that's already been going on, but also the thing I wanted to especially draw to your attention is the way that we plan to use Mythgard Miscellany as a platform for members of our community to publish stuff here. So we invite people to submit anything. A paper, a presentation, a performance, music, film, cosplay, whatever it is, and submit it. We're gonna be curating these. Like it's not gonna be. We're not just gonna be reposting everything. It's not just like an open board where anyone can post anything. We're gonna be publishing this stuff basically through Mythgard Miscellany. But right now, we just want to hear from as many people as possible. There has been it's been one of my experiences, and it's one that I've shared with many people, that often, one sees something or hears something. This happens to me all the time at conferences, right? I'll be at a conference and I'll be hearing a brilliant paper, a brilliant presentation at a conference, and I'll be like, oh man, that was so good. Like, more people should see this. Like, this needs to, like, get circulated somehow. how, but there's like no mechanism, right? There's no mechanism for that. So often things that I've seen at conferences, papers that I've heard at conferences, sometimes, they might go on to get published, but that's a very, very small minority. And often the presentation doesn't even lend itself well to like traditional, publication in a scholarly journal or something like that. And yet it is still very worthy of being circulated, of being published. So we want to cast a really wide net here to say, because there are so many people, so many brilliant and talented people who have really cool ideas or do really awesome things. And we want there to be a place where folks can submit those and where we can, showcase many of the wonderful ideas and wonderful things going on coming from you guys in our community. So if you click on submit your work now, this is a form to where you can submit anything, whatever it is. We really are quite open about this. And look forward to folks submitting. So just wanted to draw this to your attention. There have been a lot of times when we have talked about like paper topics and things and conference paper topics emerging out of our discussions, when I've said things like, oh, this would be really fascinating to kind of pursue this particular argument or that particular argument or something. And I know that many of you get into discussions and debates on the discussion boards. It might be really interesting to kind of take, something like a thread that you've contributed to and really kind of put your thoughts together in a sort of a more cohesive form and like one continuous form and submit it, right, as a presentation, as a kind of paper. So I think that would be really, really cool. Anyway, there's lots of opportunities, I think, for things that have come from this. But can you post other people's work with attribution? Probably I'd get their permission first before I submitted it. But yeah, I mean, you could certainly encourage people to do that. But yeah. Yeah, and Matt, you're absolutely right. Matt says the entire academy is a combination of fandoms that have been declared legitimate. Don't let your fear that your passion is less worthy than don't give in to your fear that your passion is less worthy than those with degrees. Yeah, no, I agree. I absolutely agree. And there's again, it's been my experience from the beginning. I remember having. There was an interesting moment. It was one of those moments when that was just really revelatory to me about how little many people in academia don't understand about like the world. It was when I started my podcast. And of course, when I started my podcast, as many of you might know, I was still an untenured tenure track English professor down in Maryland, and of course, so like one of the big immediate questions in the year, 2 years after I started my podcast was like, okay, how is this going to relate to my tenure decision, right? Because here I am like diverting all this time into my podcast, which I could have spent publishing in reputable journals and that kind of thing. So like was any of my scholarly work on my podcast going to count towards my tenure evaluation and such? And anyway, I remember having this conversation with my dean, and my dean says, well, like the advantage of participating in peer-reviewed publications is that your ideas are going to be challenged and sharpened by others, who know the field really well, who know the field as well as you. If you're just, lecturing to the general public, you're just kind of, speaking out there, and there's no, you're not meeting that kind of resistance to your ideas. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, have you ever talked to the general public? And I'm like, I don't know, Mr. Dean, sir. That has not been my experience, let me tell you. I mean, the way in which it's just been my experience from the very beginning of my podcast. Like as soon as I began receiving any kind of communication from people who are listening to my podcast, it was clear that I was speaking to a group of my peers as far as, our enthusiasm and even knowledge of Tolkien was concerned. I've never, felt myself like superior to being like, I know, you don't know Tolkien, right? I know, just sit back and listen to me, the master. Like, it's like, that's ridiculous, right? I have been so grateful for the contributions, challenges, corrections, debates that I've had with people. I have never grown more as a scholar and as an intellectual than through my public broadcasts, both here with you guys and in other things that I've done. I have found myself continually challenged, both challenged to learn more and to grow and to be learning as I go from you guys, my listeners. So anyway, it was that was just, as I say, a moment when I was like, wow, okay, so like the ivory tower is kind of real. Like that's actually true. But anyway, that's so yes. What I'm saying is, I have enormous respect for the knowledge and expertise of so many of you, and I know that you all have things to contribute, lots of different things to contribute. And by the way, don't ever let anybody convince you that in order to have something to contribute, it means that you have to have thought of something or asked a question that nobody has ever asked before, come up with an answer that no one's ever said before. This is like the great delusion of the modern intellectual world, which I find enormously frustrating. Like, it is just not true. And it has led whole generations now of scholars to spend their entire careers pursuing minutiae and trivia, just for the sake of being able to say, I'm doing something nobody ever did before. And I don't even consider that valuable. Like, it's when if I'm assessing something that someone is saying about a work, about anything, but has anyone ever talked about this before, or even has anyone suggested anything like this before, is not even an evaluative question I ask. It's not even relevant. Anyway, that's Drowsnake says the entire scientific method is literally asking questions that have already been asked. Absolutely. So anyway, all right, I'll stop. I've gotten onto this whole diversion, challenging modern academia and such, and that was not my intention when I started off here. The point is, I encourage everybody to think about submitting, as I think that there are lots of other things. Exactly, Arnas. Just because something's been explored already doesn't mean there's nothing left to find. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Even, and if you're looking at a passage that's been examined before, asking a question of something that's been asked before, but it hasn't been asked by you, right? I can promise you're going to bring something different to this, that, it doesn't matter even if your conclusion agrees with things that other people have said. That itself is interesting, is important. So anyway, whatever. You're right, man. That's not that I'm apologizing for challenging modern academia. I know that's been my MO for a long time. I'm not taking that back. I'm just saying that's not what I came here to talk about tonight. But anyway, but so Mythgard Miscellany. That was the point. All right. A couple other quick things. Mythmoot. Don't forget about Mythmoot. We have the early bird pricing for Mythmoot in June, the end of June. Our big conference ends at the end of January, so it was already extended, so it's definitely going to end at the end of January. So if you're thinking about joining us at Mythmoot, which you totally should think about joining us at Mythmoot, the early bird pricing is going to be ending for that soon. So I definitely encourage you to do that, because Mythmoot is so much fun. Been thinking about Mythmoot a lot over this past week and helping to plan some sessions that we're going to do and everything. And just, beginning to look forward to it again. Mythmoot is such a wonderful time. Yeah. Interesting. Aspen said, my friend asked when I told her about this, what would Tolkien think about his work being gone over paragraph by paragraph? So on the one hand, I certainly don't think that Tolkien was very humble. I don't think he would have been like, well, naturally, like, they're only scratching the surface of my marvelous work. Like, he wouldn't have anything, so in that level, he'd be like, well, would he say that I think that naturally everybody should, spend 2 hours a week for their entire lives, like discussing my book? I don't think he'd have that kind of response, but at the same time, the kind of thing that we're doing, like really that on a session by session basis, would he like what we're doing? Yeah. I'm not saying I think he'd always agree with us, right? I'm sure he would like disagree wildly with a whole bunch of things that, that I have said, that we have said. He'd argue with us all the time, but would he enjoy this kind of analysis? Yeah. You see him doing this all over the place, right? I mean, he was always ready to like, quote a passage and look at it carefully and see what it suggested. That's how he always answered questions when people asked him questions. So like ask him, what happened to the Entwives, and he won't say like, well, here's what I think might. No, he will go back and he'll say, well, let's look at the text and see where it refers to it and what conclusions we can draw from that. Right. So he loved doing this kind of analysis to his own work. Anyway, yeah. He'd say we were going too fast, Strauss-Neg. It's possible. He would say that. I'm not sure whether to spell out the letters W-O-B-H, or is it just like one syllable, like woob, and how do you do the H? I have questions about your username. But anyway, yes, I do agree with you that Tolkien was inviting this sort of discourse. Absolutely. Bjorning, I don't think the Inkling spent this long, right, on discussing things, right? Or they never would have come in, they'd all have been dead, right, before they got through the Lord of the Rings, given the ages they were when they started. But yeah. I think that this kind of close reading individually would appeal in some ways. Evil Dr. Cannon says Tolkien would approve of our likelihood of never finishing. Yeah, or rather, Evil Dr. Cannon, I would turn that around positively and say, the mere fact that you are unlikely to finish is no deterrent from starting, right? Or even persevering therein. But also, and not to brag, but we've already persevered a good deal longer than Tolkien often did, right? If you look at the amount of time that he spent pursuing, and I mean, like, yeah, you can look at like the Silmarillion and say, oh, he spent like 40, 45 years writing that, but that's not really true, right? I mean, he wrote a whole bunch of things, started and stopped writing a whole bunch of things at various points, which is not exactly the same thing. So I think we've already shown some fair stamina here in our fifth year. But you're right. Now there you go, Evil Dr. Cannon. If we were to stop and say, wait a second, we need to go back to the beginning of Fellowship and start over because we missed some stuff earlier, which we did, right? We missed some stuff earlier on, so we got to go back and start over. That would be quite like Tolkien, right? Quite like Tolkien. Absolutely. Okay. We do need to go back, and you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Seven. And I don't see any reason not to. I mean, I think it would be kind of fun, wouldn't it, to have the very at the very end of our discussion be the long expected party, basically. And concerning hobbits, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we can definitely go back and end there at the beginning. Now, David Michael Roberts on Twitch, I totally agree with you that He says, somehow I don't think that Dyson would have wanted to, that is, go into this much detail in the Inklings meetings. And I certainly agree. From everything, from all of the records, Dyson would have quite objected to discussing the Lord of the Rings at this pace. Yeah. Well, Trifle, we did go too fast at the beginning of The Shadow of the Past, but it was in Gandalf's conversation with Frodo that we made the shift. It would be interesting. Well, maybe in the course of like reviewing earlier things for the web project, somebody could find this. I wonder, what was the last paragraph we skipped? Like, when exactly did we start going sentence by sentence, skipping nothing? My memory is that it is somewhere around the backstory of the ring. Like in Eregion, remember that sentence when Gandalf starts giving the backstory? Somewhere around there. I mean, we did do the whole Bilbo-Gandalf confrontation passage at the end of Chapter 1, but that was only just one part of Chapter 1 that we did that on. But anyway... No, it was before the end of Chapter 2 that we started. I know the most of that, most of the conversation between Frodo and Gandalf was, and then Chapter 3 full. Yeah, definitely. It was at most halfway through. Yeah. But it's true. I might still have been rushing. Anyway, speaking of rushing or not rushing, let us move forward. Stanza 5. Well, as before, let's reread stanzas 1 through 4 and then look at stanza 5 to make sure that all of our expectations and our sense of the shape and patterns are clear in our minds as we approach stanza 5. I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, of meadow flowers and butterflies in summers that have been, of yellow leaves and gossamer in autumns that there were, with morning mist and silver sun and wind upon my hair. I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. For still there are so many things that I have never seen. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. Okay, so we remember the patterns there, how the pattern has been shifting, right? We, of course, recall, going forward, not backwards. We recall that perfect symmetrical shape between 1 and 2, how that breaks down between 3 and 4. But we saw a couple other interesting shifts there. I was blown away by the conclusion that we kind of came to that I hadn't suspected before about the hopefulness of stanza 4. About his looking towards the, and that kind of hinged upon the reading of the tense, right? I have never seen, the way that he shifts back to the present perfect there, like he was speaking in at the very first stanza. No longer just speaking about the negatives in the future, right? Not how he shifts that stanza not to be about what I will never see, but instead that I have never seen. And then speaking of that, we were speaking of Estelle, of hope, right? The Estelle that in every wood, in every spring, there is a different green, which sort of hope and confidence seems to be sort of augmented by the idea, the possibility of reading stanza 3 in the kind of apocalyptic way, almost even fearful way that we were discussing before. That is, thinking about the possibility of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I will ever see, or maybe anybody will ever see, right? What if winter comes and spring does not come after? What if Sauron wins, right? Is one potential reading lying behind that stanza. And if it does lie behind that stanza, then it would seem to be redressed, in a sense, in stanza 4 here, right? By this contemplation of the future that will surely come, the spring, the new greens that will come, new not only in the sense of new from spring, new in the spring from winter, but also new in the sense of ever new, right? New every year. In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. Now, stanza 5. So stanza 5, we have reason to think that although the exact symmetry thing that we saw, or nearly exact symmetry thing that we saw happening in stanzas 1 and 2 did not happen again in stanzas 3 and 4. We did not get exactly that same level of correspondence at all. Yet as we approach stanzas 5 and 6, we certainly should be wondering, right, are we going to see that again? Are we going to return to something like that? And if not, how is this, here is where we're beginning to get towards the end of the poem, and thus we can begin to be looking at not only the shape and structure of the individual stanzas, but how those themselves contribute to the shape of the overall whole of the poem. And the beginning of stanza 5. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Okay. As before, rhythm first. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Once again, very regular iambs, right? Once he is not deviating from that pattern which has been most consistent throughout the entire poem. The very, very regular sound pattern, right? I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Almost perfect again. And there isn't even that same kind. Last time I spent a long time trying to figure out, and I think we finally figured it out, that because it's about the consonants, right? The way in which every wood in every spring there is a different green doesn't change, doesn't deviate from that rhythm, but seems to drag at it, right? Seems to affect the flow, even though it doesn't actually change the rhythm. And I think we can see that in this stanza, or we can hear rather that in this stanza, we don't get that, right? We don't get that. I don't think I hear any kind of disruption. Let me do it again. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. No, I don't hear, again, perfectly regular, but I don't hear any of that sort of resistance we were pushing through in stanza 4, or even that kind of like dilation, that kind of distortion almost of like meadow flowers and butterflies that I was talking about before. Notice again the vast preponderance of monosyllables throughout this stanza, right? We have exactly 3 two-syllable words in this whole stanza, right? Beside people and people, right? No, never. Sorry, never. Forgot about never. 4. We got never, which is an important one, actually, right? Okay, so that's interesting, but we don't get I think it's one reason why it seems even more smooth. The sound seems even more smooth. Again, notice the pattern here as we were looking at before. I sit, which we've seen before, beside the fire and think of people long ago. The fire and think of people. Notice again how the unstressed syllables are, we've got an article, a conjunction, a preposition, right? Again, once again, it's if you want to make perfect iambs, using monosyllables like this is a really easy way to do that, right? Well, not that it's ever easy, but it's it makes it a little bit simpler. And people who will see a world that I shall never know. Okay. Bigger picture rhythms. The lines. What do we notice about the lines? What do we notice about the lines? I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. What's the pattern, and what's it most like? Again, this is stanza 5, right? So we've had a bunch of different sort of structural patterns, sort of rhythmic, sort of syntactic shapes, right, in the poem so far. We do get enjambment, Drow Snake, between lines 1 and 2, and between lines 2 and 3, right? Those clearly flow together. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Yes. So enjambment between lines 1 and 2 with a break in the middle, and a break with a comma, which absolutely should be bringing us back to the first 2 stanzas, right? That's just how those 2 worked. In fact, you'll remember that that's one of the shapes that we first established, right? We have 2, there's a semicolon at the end, right? So we've got 2 lines enjambed, comma, 2 lines enjambed, semicolon, 2 lines enjambed, comma, 2 lines enjambed, period, right? And the semicolon, of course, is one of the things that sort of points to how closely linked together stanzas 1 and 2 are, right? So we don't get that in stanza 5, but we do get that same pattern. And remember, we deviated from it in stanza 3 with all enjambment, right? Nothing not enjambed there in stanza 3. And then in stanza 4, we had a harder stop in the middle with that colon. For still there are so many things that I have never seen, colon, such as, right? And then instead of getting a list, we get in every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. So that doesn't do kind of what we might expect it to do, perhaps. This is, again, much more like, you'll remember, what did the kind of comma, what did the comma mean, right, in those first, like, what was it accomplishing, apart from telling us to breathe, right? Telling us to break there at the end of the second line. Well, what we were seeing is that it was signaling to us that there was a series of things, right? I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, comma, of meadow flowers, right? I think of this, of that, and that in this. Also of this, in that, with that, and that, right? That's the logic of the first 2 stanzas, right? It's lists, right? All of which goes back to, I sit beside the fire and think, this is what I'm sitting beside the fire and thinking about, right? And then we noticed how that shifted in stanzas 3 and 4, but in stanza 5, we return to a similar, not identical, but a similar kind of logical structure that the rhythm sets us up for, right? I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago. So we're starting with the of again, which is important, right? Of people long ago, comma. The similarity is that we are adding a thing, right? I sit beside the fire and think of this and that, right? So in that way, it is like the flow of stanza 1. But it's also different from it because we don't get another of, right? Blad the Inspired is exactly right. The function of and in the third line is a little different. Yes, yeah, I agree. And people who will see a world that I shall never know. So he could have said, of people long ago, of people who will see a world that I shall never know. Except he can't. Why can't he? Why can't he say of there? If he said up there, well, then he can't put a period, right? If it's going to be a list, it would have to carry on, right? That we need more items to the list. He had that before, right? Because of the way that stanzas 1 and 2 were combined together. We had of this, of that, and that, of this, right? Of this and that, right? With this. So it introduced a larger group, right? Here, he's still ending this stanza with a period. It is not like stanza 1 in that way, right? So it is a list, right? We do have the stanza divided into 2 halves, which we did not get in stanza 3, right? But look at this. Let's go back and compare it to stanza 3, because I think this really kind of sets it off, right? Look back to stanza 3 and remember how that kept accumulating subordination, right? I sit beside the fire and think of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see, right? It's all one idea, continually rolling and continually just adding subordination, right? There's only one thing that he's thinking of. It takes a while to explain what it is, right? How the world will be under this condition, under that other condition, explained in this way, right? I mean, that's the when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. This continual clarification of just the one idea of how the world will be. We'll look back at stanza 5. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. We get the subordination again in lines 3 and 4, right? And people who will see a world, which world? The world that I shall never know, right? But we don't have the continuous subordination. It's not about one thing. It's about 2 things, right? This stanza is divided in half, right? Of people long ago and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Those are there are 2 things that he's thinking of in this stanza, right? And so we can hear that. Like, we're made to feel that, even if you don't process it, right? Even if you don't process it, you hear it, right? The poem makes you feel it. That comma at the beginning, which is what makes it flow so differently than stanza 3, makes you pause, makes you realize that it's doubled there. Okay. Yeah, Gildella and I agree. Repeating of makes it sound like they're in the same group. Yeah, I think that's a good way. That's a good way of saying it. Yeah. It clearly is 2 different groups of people here. Now, what else? Other sound patterns. I guess we could think about rhyme. We were noticing last time in stanza 4 that we had reached a kind of climax, right? There's the dominant rhyme, which has been both repeated but also played with throughout, right? The line 2, line 4 rhyme, seen being were hair, so it gets weak in stanza 2. Will be ever see, B and C, okay, clearer, and not only clearer but repeating. Seen and being and B and C is not only just as strong, it's the same rhyme in different verb forms, right? Same words. And then seen and green, right? So we take that seeing concept, which has been part of the core rhyme of now 3 out of 4 stanzas, right? But instead of combining it with being, as he's combined it before, now he combines seen with green, right? That hoped for, trusted in future that we were looking at last time. But of course, we were also noticing that there was this other kind of rhyming thing. Stanza 1 didn't have any other rhyme. Like, there was like think and butterflies Nothing, those aren't even nodding acquaintances, right? But then we noticed in the second stanza we had gossamer and that there were, which is a strong rhyme and the more conspicuous because of the weakness of the main rhyme, right? He has proven he knows how to make a rhyme for the word were, right? He could have made another one in that last line if he had chosen to, but he didn't choose to, right? So we have the weakened central rhyme and the emergence of this other internal rhyme, right? Between 1 and 2, internally binding up the gossamer and autumns that there were, that autumn imagery in there. In stanza 3, we had the return of think, but instead, so just as we had the return of B and C, which sounds like I'm saying the letters like you say a rhyme scheme, like the B rhyme and the C rhyme. No, I'm talking about the words, B-E and S-E-E, right? We've got the return of B and C as the primary rhyme. And we also have the return of think, of course, as he's repeating that first line. But this time, instead of having the word think floating out there totally unconnected with the end of line 3, as in butterflies, he instead pairs it with spring, which is not a rhyme, but it's a lot closer, right? All of a sudden it starts to sound close. Think, spring. They're first cousins, right? In some ways, right? We get that IN sound in the middle, which links them together, but they still don't rhyme, but they're leaning in that direction, which is interesting because then in stanza 4, when we have seen and green, that equally strong rhyme in 2 and 4, we have, as I said, the pinnacle, right? We've got things and spring, still not a rhyme. And again, I would go so far as to say deliberately close, but not quite, right? Again, he could have contrived to rhyme those perfectly if he'd wanted to, right? But he doesn't. He's got things plural and spring singular so that they are very close to a strong perfect rhyme and yet not quite at a strong perfect rhyme. What do we get in stanza 4? We get a strong rhyme in lines 2 and 4 again, right? Just as we've gotten in 3/4 of the stanzas so far, except for stanza 2 where we had that were and hair thing. But the rhyme is different. That might seem obvious. I mean, it is obvious. That might seem really simple, but now that we've had seen, bean, C, B, well, I guess it was the other way around. Seen, bean, B, C, right? And then seen, green. I don't know about you, but my ear was ready for an E rhyme there, right? And we didn't get it. We get an O rhyme instead, right? People long ago that I shall never know. Strong rhyme, right? So the sound of it is just as satisfying. But it's different. In those internal rhymes, we get think again, right? Our third return of think. Think was paired with butterflies the first time. It was paired with, what was it paired with? Spring, right? Spring the second time, right? Think butterflies, think spring, now think world. And arguably that's even further from a rhyme than spring and butterflies was, right? We've turned away from that secondary rhyme now entirely, right? Interesting. Yeah, Blad the Inspirer says, looking at the rhymes in the second and fourth lines, it seems like the stanzas can be separated into 2 sound groups. 1, 3, and 4, that is the C, B, seen, green ones, and 2, 5, and 6. Yeah, certainly 5 and 6. 2 just seems to me to kind of stand out in this way. Okay. I don't know yet what to do with that observation, with our departure from ease right? I mean, again, my ear now associates, after 4 stanzas, my ear associates a perfect strong rhyme there in lines 2 and 4 with that E sound. Indeed, with the word see in particular, right? The word see has been involved everywhere, and the linking of the word seen with the word green in stanza 4 seems quite significant under the circumstances, right? But the shift to a go and no seems important. And here's the other thing that makes it seem even more important to me. Look at that last line, right? That I shall never know. And look at line 2 of stanza 4. That I have never seen, right? It's almost a perfect repetition, right? The I have never, I shall never know seen, right? So we talked about how that last line is shifting from seen, from the E sound to the O sound. That's because he's replacing that idea of seeing with this idea of knowing, right? And you think about, there's a reason that see has been an important rhyming word, right? Indeed, one could say that see, the word see, has been one of the sort of thematic dominant words of this entire poem, right? I mean, what are the most important words? First of all, you always got to pay attention to verbs, right? Verbs are almost always important. No, verbs are always important, without exception, right? Verbs are what happens. Like, verbs are what make a sentence a sentence. So definitely, you always got to pay attention to the verbs. And sitting is important, but thinking, right? I sit beside the fire and think. So we've got think, think, think. This is our third repetition of think. Thinking is one of the dominant ideas of this poem, right? One crude way to summarize this poem would be the poem about what Bilbo is thinking about, right? That's what he claims to be describing. I sit beside the fire and think, he says 3 different times, starting 3 different pairs of stanzas in order to tell us what he's thinking about, right? But notice again, within that context, right, of all of this thinking that's going on, he's been focusing on seeing. I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen. That's what he's thinking about. He's thinking about what he has witnessed. And remember how this fits in with our readings of especially those first 2 stanzas, where the verbs that he uses and the way that he describes these things, he's not thinking about himself, right? He's not the protagonist. Remember, we said it's distant from him. He's just thinking about the summers that have been and autumns that there were, right? It's the summers and the autumns that are important. The fact that he was there to see them is an incidental and possibly not very important element, right? So it keeps coming back to what he has seen. That's been his role. I mean, he's thinking about it, but what he's thinking about, his role within the frame of his thought, right, he's not thinking about anything that he's done. He's thinking about what he's seen, including when he shifts in stanza 3 to the future. Right? What is he thinking about in stanza 3? How the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. So the seeing comes back into it, right? This spring that will not be witnessed by him, right? In the way that the summer and the autumn of the first 2 stanzas were at least witnessed by him, experienced by him, even though he wasn't responsible to them or whatever, right? He continues the I have never seen thing in stanza 4, right? Thinking about that, this causes him to think more about the things that he has never seen and possibly will never see, or maybe in the more hopeful reading that we had last week, have not seen yet, right? In every wood, in every spring, there is a different green. And notice again, the link between seen and green, that core rhyme of that stanza is once more gives the springs in question, right? the future springs, this infinite stream of future springs that will come in every wood in every spring, always with a new color and a new freshness. Once again, they're existing on their own, right? They just are. The green is. As when we were looking at the syntactic structure of that, saying what's the subject and the verb, right? The green is. That's what he hasn't seen, what he's thinking about, what he hasn't seen, right? But it's still the kind of question, right? Is like, he's still within the frame of his thought. He's still been the protagonist, not the protagonist. He's still been the observer, right? Of these seasons and of the world and of the seasons. Now what's happened in the Stanza? So that seeing, it has been, C has been that core rhyme. That's why that E sound is so important, right? It's not only that sound, the sound is a hint. And this, by the way, is why I always start with the sounds, right? Because, did you ever ask that question? Or you might have asked this question in a couple different ways. Maybe you were writing an English paper at some point and you were like, I think I see this, right? I think I can see how to talk about that. I have this reading of this, but is this just BS? Am I just making this up, right? Is it just me? Like, I don't know if you ever asked that question, right? Maybe you didn't care. It's like, as long as like your teacher would swallow it, who cares? But when you start doing this stuff for a living, you start asking that question, right? Like, okay, I've got this cool reading, right? I think that this poem is doing something awesome, but is it just me? Am I just being clever, right? Like, am I just like imposing upon this, this poem something which is merely a construct of my own imagination? And like, that's always a risk, right? One always can end up doing that. So this is one of the primary reasons why, when we've been talking about this poem and when we talk about other poems, Fourth Thoughtless says we used to have meta arguments about this in English class all the time. Yeah, and Fourth Thoughtless, I will say, long before I achieved the level of doubt or humility required to ask that question of myself, I began arrogantly asking it of my English teachers, right? I mean, I clearly remember sitting in 10th grade English class saying, she's just making this up. This is ridiculous. I remember the day on which I was saying that in 10th grade English class. And then, of course, again, later on, one comes to the horrible conclusion that one can apply that same question to one's own readings as well. Anyway, the point is, this is why I always start with sounds, right? If you can get in your ear the sound patterns of the poem, like the conclusion we were just drawing about the way in which stanza 5 is so importantly divided in half, right? With those two groups, like the difference between the people long ago and the people who will see a world, right? Now that's a fairly obvious thing. I'm not saying that that's some kind of like deep reading of that, of this stanza. He's thinking about two different groups of people there, right? But notice how that fits, how well that clicks with this. Like, again, your ear tells you, you need to put a break between the people long ago and the people who will see a world that I shall never know, right? Your ear will tell you in that sense that reading is right, sort of, right? Or at least might lead you to be more confident in it. That's why I always like to start with this kind of thing. So again, coming back to this. So this is why, and also sometimes your ear will just draw things to your notice that you might not have noticed. So like, for instance, I would very likely, if he didn't use it in a rhyming word, it probably, like repeatedly in a rhyming word, it probably would have taken me a long time to notice what I was just describing, that pattern of seeing and how important seeing is in the first four stanzas, right? Within the framework of the thinking. Like saying that, I feel pretty confident in that reading, that's clearly the shape, the sort of the mental shape of this poem. but I might not have noticed it. And in any case, having noticed it, I feel very confident in it, given the sound shape, right? Given the fact not only is that word repeated, it's repeated in rhyming couplets. And not only is it repeated in rhyming couplets, but those same rhyming couplets are being repeated. Like again, that seen, been, be, see, seen, green. It's like, that's obviously important, right? That has got to be like, there's a progression there. Like those 6 words on their own point towards a shape, right? That we can begin to see, that we can begin to feel. Yeah. Okay. And now we have an equally strong rhyme, but it's for the first time not C and B, and it has nothing to do with seeing. Instead, it has to do with knowing. And just in case we miss the shift or our ear does not pick up on it, we can see the repeated pattern which emphasizes it, that shift from I have never seen to I shall never know. And know is the strong word. Know, ago. And thinking about that pair of words, where does that pair of words push us? Ago, know. Well, ago puts us in a familiar place, right? Because we lived in ago for at least 2 stanzas, right? He was in the past, thinking about like summers that have been and autumns that there were. Those are both ago, right? That framework of past time, of thinking about the world as it was, the world that he has seen, right, that he has observed, but that which was. The shift then comes in stanza 3 when he asks us to look into, when he tells us he's thinking about the future, how the world will be, right? Now the seeing still comes in, right? Without a spring that I shall ever see, right? And then of course in the 4, he continues thinking about the future in one sense, right? And yet we notice that subtle shift of tenses where he was not saying shall never in stanza 4. He was saying I have never seen. But we had the seen, and then we had the green, which is the stuff that he hasn't seen yet, and may not see, perhaps. Okay, but anyway, so I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago. On the one hand, that O sound is new. This is an innovation from an oral standpoint, right? It's a new sound that we haven't rested on like this before. And so it on the one hand tips us off that something has changed, right? But at the same time, the subject matter is not different. Well, the subject matter is different, but the frame isn't different. Again, we've been thinking about ago. We spent at least 2 solid stanzas thinking about long ago, right? That which was. There is a shift that it's people that we're thinking about now instead of seasons, right? It was all very impersonal before, except in as much as he was personifying the seasons themselves, which was not all that much. Not very strongly anyway. Okay, fine. But that last line, that I shall never know, that's what we were being set up for by that unexpected O rhyme, right? I mean, I sit beside the fire and think of people, like if you'd read the poem, right, stanzas 1 through 4, and then read the first line and a half of stanza 5, right? I sit beside the fire and think of people, and asked me to guess how the line ended, I would have said, I have seen, or something like that, right? People I can see, or whatever. Like that's what that thinking always led to seeing before, always, and one way or another, either immediately or eventually. That is either in line 2 or in line 4, right? Is in stanzas 1 and in stanza 3. But instead we get people long ago and people who will see a world. Once again, it's like a setup. People who will see a world. We've gotten this before. I did it again. We've gotten this before. of how the world will be when winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see, right? We've gotten and people who will see a world that I shall never see. I mean, like, that's what we expect, right? That surely either line 2 or line 4 has to end in seeing, right? But it's not ending in seeing. It's ending in knowing that I shall never know. What does that mean, do you think? What does that suggest? Bjorn in Exile says, shift from his personal perception to awareness of others. Good. Yeah, some others have commented, and I'm sorry, I know I'm missing a bunch of comments. He's moving from self-regard to regard of the whole story. Yes. Mostly. The one correction, well, not correction. The one way I differ from that is that, remember, he was never exactly talking about self-regard in the early stanzas. Right? I mean, it was never, he was never the object, right? He was the subject, but he was never really the object. Like, the word that's never been used is me, right? We get my once with my hair, but we've never gotten me. That is to say, he's never been the object of the verb, right? It's been about what he's seen, but the focus has been not on himself, right, but on what he's seen. So in a sense, you could say he's kind of related similarly. He's focusing on the world that I shall never know. You could say a world I shall never know, a world, how the world will be, right? When winter comes without a spring that I shall ever see. Similar ideas. Yes, looking towards a future without him in it, right? Yeah, I agree. As Bjarnasonar says, and as usual, Bjarnasonar knows how to speak about this stuff with very much more precision than I do. Bjarnasonar says, semantically, he's been the experiencer, not even the agent. Yes, exactly. Then now that I shall never know. What is the difference? That there is a shift. Our ears tell us. A go and no. What is the significance of that shift? I'm not sure I see it yet. Well, let's keep looking at a couple other things. First, alliteration. We've skipped alliteration. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. Oh, hang on a second. How do we miss that? There is seeing, right? Smack, we still get to see, right? Sit beside has never yet failed to lead to see. See, once and notice, when did I notice that? As soon as I asked the question about the consonants, right? Consonants led me right to it, right? Sitting beside always leads to seeing. But yeah, it's a big difference, right? He's not the one seeing. It's people, other people who are seeing there. That's true. That's true. But it's still there, and we can hear it in that the way in which sit beside, that repetition of the S's on the stressed syllable in line 1, which we've heard now 3 times, right? And we got a version of it. Remember, we were looking in stanza 4 with still so many things, which also leads to seeing, right? And in that case, to spring as well. Okay, so we got the S's, which led there. What else do you notice? Alliteration. What else do you notice? Yes, drow snake, never know. That's really important. And that one is sneaky, right? It's sneaky for all you poor people who are visual learners instead of audio learners. And I don't mean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not saying you're poor. It's just there are some things that are going to be harder. And this is one of them, right? Because you might look at that last line and not even notice the alliteration, right? But if you're an audio person, you can't miss it. That I shall never know. It's a strong alliteration to end with. And hang on a second. Have we gotten that yet? Nope, we haven't. We haven't. We've gotten morning mist and silver sun. We got all those W's in the middle of stanza 3. We had those really interesting middle of the word alliteration things going on with never, every different in stanza 4. But we've certainly never ended a stanza with an alliterative couplet, if I could coin that phrase, which is kind of awkward and not really accurate, but maybe I shouldn't use couplet. Duplet? I don't know. Anyway, 2 alliterating words in a row. Pair. How about pair? Fourth Thomas, I like that. Yeah, an alliterative pair that I shall never know. Strong ending of the stanza, right? It's funny. Somebody just did the pointing up emoji to Fourth Dauntless's comment, and I feel like that's exactly what the alliteration does right there. It puts the like pointy up finger, like pay attention to that, to the no, right? And what does it do? It emphasizes the no, never know, which rhymes strongly with the ago, which is that new rhyming sound. Okay. Anyway. What else? Alliteration. What else? What else do you notice? Well, there's a really obvious one, which is so obvious that you're probably shy about pointing it out. But that's, yeah, the repetition of people, right? On the one hand, it's like cheating, right? Because it's the same word. But it's particularly conspicuous, Drousnake, for exactly the reason that you're pointing out. Because the word people has, it's a twofer, right? 2 P's each, right? So by repeating the word people twice, he gets 4 explosive P sounds in those central 2 lines of people long ago and people who will see a world. And this is not normal. Have we gotten repetition like that? Like direct word repetition? I don't think we have. Nope. Not in the same stanza, I mean. No, I don't think we have. Within... Okay, every. Good. Yeah. Thank you, Vlad. I'd forgotten about that. Every. That was the closest that we got. Good. Yeah, Dan was just pointing that out too. Yep. Okay, every. And we were talking about how significant that was, right? And notice there's a similar... it has no, I'm trying to say this sentence carefully. Similarly, it has a strong oral effect, right? I was trying to be careful there because I didn't want to say it had a similar effect, because it doesn't have a similar effect. The effect of people and people is quite different from the effect of every and every in line 3 of stanza 4. It's not the same effect by any means, I think. But it is similar in that it has a strong effect on the sound shape of that stanza. I sit beside the fire and think of people long ago, and people who will see a world that I shall never know. There's a b in beside in line 1. I'm just like, I'm thinking about labials. I'm thinking about those explosive consonants, right? B, beside, is a labial consonant as well, but it's on an unstressed syllable. It's much softer than people. And that's interesting. Yeah. People who will see a world. And yeah, let's look at that. Bjorning, that's a great question. Apart from spring, I don't think we've gotten any P's in the entire poem to this point. Spring. Spring, spring. The only 2 P's, I think. Only 2 P's in the poem. The people, long ago. Yeah. And yeah, Rachel, on YouTube, I agree with you. The P's, the explosiveness of the P's that make those 2 peoples jump out would make even one of the peoples jump out, right? And doubly, right, when there are the 2 of them right there, all of those 4 P's, right? It is made the more conspicuous by the fact that, as Rachel was pointing out, there haven't been people in the poem at all to this point. This has not been a poem that's been very interested in people, really, at all, right? I sit beside the fire and think of people is a shift in topic, right? A shift really in the whole focus of the poem, really. Yeah. That's what I'm talking about in the whole poem to this point. It is hard not to pay attention to the P's that I'm using in talking about it, and yet the poem itself does not do that. So, Bjorning, I don't consider spring emphasized by the explosive consonant because it's not at the beginning. To really get the power and punch of the P, it really has to be at the beginning of the word, right? Spring, the sp, the P is softer because it's got that sibilant before it, right? Spring. You just kind of trip into it. Yeah, because it's not aspirated in the same way. Exactly. But when you've got P at the beginning of a word like that, it really smacks you in the face like that. And then you need to double it within the word and then double it line to line. Very strong. Okay. So we definitely need to pay attention to that. Now, I want to come back to the other, right. Graham says the bane of sound engineers everywhere. Exactly. Right. Yeah. You don't have to tell anybody who's ever been a sound engineer about how explosive the P is. Right. I mean, like the letter P, those podcasters who have like the little screen that's attached to their microphone between them and their microphone. That's like the letter P shield. Right. Almost entirely. Right. Yeah. That's just what I avoid this by having my microphone not straight in front of my face. It's off to the side a little bit so that it doesn't get the full force of the explosive P's. They're called pop filters. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is apt, I think, as pop is exactly what it's trying to control. Yeah. Anyway, so right. Okay. I want to come back to, what was it? Fourth Dauntless, I think, was talking about this a while back. I think it was. When I was asked, yes, it was Fourth Dauntless. Other alliteration observations, I was noting this too. The W's come back. Who will see a world? It is much weaker. We don't get the flood of W's we got in stanza 3, right? World will be when winter comes without, right? World will win winter without. We got those 5 W's there in those 2 lines. Indeed, we were saying noticing how we got 5 strong w sounds in 7 words right there in those middle of the 2 lines. Like I was really dominant. And I agree. Who doesn't count? Who doesn't really fit? Will, world comes back, and we got will and world. Those were 2 of our 5 before, and it is in line 3, so it is similarly in the middle of the stanza like it was in stanza 3. And given that we are the repetition of the initial line, I sit beside the fire and think, should prompt us to kind of put 1, 3, and 5 together and do that kind of comparison. So there's reasons that we should notice that. But I agree, it's much weaker. It's like an echo of the W's in stanza 3, right? Yeah. What do you think about the L sounds? What do you think about the L sounds? Ray was talking about the L's. Rachel on YouTube was talking about the L's. We only get one initial L with long ago, right? But I think that they're right to say that we get, although long ago is the only initial L, that L sound does seem to become important as we move through lines 3 and 4, right? Of people long ago and people who will see a world that I shall never know. The long ago will, world, shall does feel important there. Will and shall, of course, are yeah, good. Blod points out that long is also the only time that the L sound is on a stressed syllable. Yeah, well, indeed, the other 3 L's are all terminal. I mean, world, technically there's a D at the end, right? But it's the sound at the, so it's combined with the D, but it's still that's coming at the end, right? That's still the end, the end game of that particular world. Yeah. Emethorn says L was my speech therapy world in the 2nd grade. Yeah, it's still my speech therapy letter. Yeah, definitely. I guess the thing that I would say is that will and shall, I mean, will and shall are practically synonyms. That they should get linked makes a certain amount of sense, right? The connection of will, shall, and long ago is a kind of an interesting one, right? As long ago is pointing into the past and will and shall are both pointing into the future. And then ironically, you've got the L at the beginning of the past one and the L's at the end of the future words, right? And if that's a pattern, world fits into the future, which makes sense because it is the world that he shall never know, right? So we've got L's at the end, future, L at the beginning, past. I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting. Yeah. I don't know what to make of that necessarily. I don't know that would necessarily work all, that he'd be adopting that as a really stable pattern. But that's the pattern that I see when I'm looking at the L's here. Okay. Yeah, both of them are away from the present, JJ, for sure. Yeah, and Blood, I agree. That shall in the last line is conspicuous because it avoids the W sound, right? Think of how different that would have been. People who will see a world that I will never know. We'd have a return of the W's with a good deal more emphasis, right? Will, world, will, never know, right? That alliterative pattern would have been very interesting and very strong, right? But he leaves it behind. He chooses shall instead. So we have the connection with will on the L's, but he could have just used the same word, right? Yeah. Okay. So many questions still. Among my questions are will and shall. Well, we're there. Let's just think about that one first. Will and shall. Why? Why? Why will and shall? I shall never know. Do you know the difference between will and shall? This is arguably an important difference, especially at this part of the Lord of the Rings. Yes, praise. That's exactly right. Gildolwyn, praise says, will refers to intent. Now equals simple future. I will equals volition. Yes. Both of them are future tense. Both of them are referring to it's like indicative future, right? This is a thing that is going to happen in the future. Like it's not that like one of them is more diffident, like this might happen, but this is definite. Like there's no difference there necessarily. But shall is a statement of simple future. Like this is the thing that is going to happen. Will involves the question of volition, and I think it does. I think it does hold up in the rest of Tolkien's writing. This is something, if we had the time, we should do a longitudinal study of, I think, the use of will and of shall. And I wouldn't think that he would have to use it consistently in this way 100% of the time to convince me that it was important. But I think we can already see there's a big difference, I would argue, between Frodo saying, I will take the ring, and Frodo saying, I shall take the ring. I think it is important. I think that Elrond would say that it was important that Frodo says, I will take the ring. And I think there are other examples like that. Now, one can always cherry pick examples, so it's not proof. But I think that my suspicion is that if we did in fact do a longitudinal study, we would find that there was a correlation there. Rowan, I think shall might feel conditional to you because it rhymes with, first of all, we don't use shall very much. I mean, in modern English, and I am drawing a distinction between Tolkien's English and modern English. In modern English, especially in American modern English, at least I should say, we don't use the word shall much at all. So will has come to just basically mean future. We use it's just future in all ways. But in the older usage, it is simple future. So I think it feels conditional because it rhymes with, should is conditional, right? And It starts with an SH, and we don't use it that often, but yeah. Yeah. That's interesting, Gildalwyn. I think that you are right. The person of the verb makes a big difference. That is, when you're speaking the first person, to say I will or I shall, the one speaks to volition and the other does not. So, but when you're speaking in the second or third person, right? And you say, you will do this, or you shall do this. Gildalwyn was saying that will would be the regular future, whereas shall would be a kind of imperative. Sort of, but you could see how that would be, right? When you're dictating, look, anytime you're speaking not in the first person, when you're speaking to anybody else in the indicative future, you're taking risks, right? I mean, you're speaking prophecy here. You will is a statement somebody can argue with. You will do that. No, I won't. Right? And when somebody says you will do this and you say I will not do that, you're talking about your will, right? What you're talking about is not what is going to occur. What you're talking about is what your will is set to do, right? Someone else trying to dictate your will and you're saying, actually, no. Whereas if somebody says you shall do this, then they're making a prophecy, right? They're saying, I don't care what you think, right? I don't care what your will is. This is what's going to happen, right? You shall do this. Very good. Yeah, Drowsnake says, quotes, I will come back with gold. Oh, no, you won't, says Farmer Maggot. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And absolutely, Almarea, that was, of course, just... that I like the movies You Shall Not Pass for this reason that Gandalf says on the bridge. I think that Gandalf the book's even stronger, but whatever, we'll get there. We're almost there. We're like so close to the bridge of Khazad Dûm. But anyway, yeah, good. Two Juice Man is saying, not by the hand of man shall he fall. Yes. Shall he fall? That's literally a prophecy, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What Gandalf says in the book is you cannot pass. Exactly. Yep. Okay. Anyway, so there's some contemplation on will and shall, and like I my suspicion is that it does track, generally, in Tolkien's world. We'll see. Anyhow, people who will see a world that I shall never know. I shall never know. It's not going to happen. Right? It's simple future in the negative. His never knowing is definite and it has nothing to do with his volition, right? His never knowing is totally out of his control. By the way, remember it was in the last stanza, that thing that we noticed about the tense that I have never seen. Remember what I said that I was assuming that he had said before I noticed that he didn't say it, was that I will never see. Remember I said that last week? When we think about that thing he didn't say in this way, here I'm now doing a close reading of the thing that I said about our close reading last week, right? By saying in my head I was hearing that I will never see, I was hearing despair, right? But you hear the volition in despair. If you say I will never do this, there's despair in there, or at least I really prefer the Middle English word one hope. It's the opposite of hope is one hope. You can have hope for something, and you can have one hope for something. Despair is like an advanced stage, right? It's like hope and despair are not perfect opposites of each other, because you can have like a little bit of hope, but you can't have like a little bit of despair. Who has a little bit of despair, right? I mean, if you're in despair, you're in despair, right? I mean, you can hardly be a little bit despairing any more than you can be a little bit pregnant. But you can have a little bit of one hope, right? Like you can have a little bit of hope. But anyway, it was that note of despair of that would have been in "I Will Never See," right? That I was hearing in my head, which was of course not what he was saying. It's different than "I shall never know." It's a simple statement. It's a prophecy, right? This is definite. My never knowing this is definite, right? Oh, very good. Ray has another quote here. "It may be that I can unlock my jewels, but never again shall I make their like. And if I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain." Yes, this is what is going to... Feanor was stating what he believed to be the facts about the future, right? This is how it certainly shall be. Though I'd say there's some irony there, Ray. I would contest Feanor's shalls there. You could even say that Feanor's fall, you can hear Feanor's fall in the fact that he has said shall when he should have said will. Like, I will break my heart and I will be slain. Is I think what he actually means, right? I think that's what's actually true. But in his head, those are shall statements, not will statements, right? And I think in my mind, that gap is like, well, that's Feanor to a T now, isn't it? Yeah. Now, I agree there's an important distinction because he does not will those things to happen. No, he does not. And he is choosing against them, right? And yet, again, I think the irony is the outcomes that he's describing that would happen, that, that shall happen under that condition I don't think that it would actually kill him unless his volition were involved. That's the part that I think is so illuminating about Feanor's condition. But anyway, not to get too sidetracked on Feanor. Okay. All right. So what's the difference then? I mean, in these lines, people who will see a world that I shall never know. What's the difference? What's the difference? Oh, we'll get to the Silmarillion someday, or I might have to leave that to others. I feel fairly confident, as much as one can ever control these things. Everything else being equal, I will likely survive to finish The Lord of the Rings. I'm not confident I would survive to the end of the Silmarillion after we, for like another 40 years or whatever. Okay. Not saying I'll never talk about the Silmarillion, but probably not like this. Okay. People who will see a world that I shall never know. Interesting. Wob. I still don't know how to say your username. Says, if we substitute must for shall, what impression do we get? Yeah. I must never know. Well, I have a problem with the must for shall substitution. It has a similar kind of force, but must puts like a moral... it said it rhymes with robe? Okay, wobe. Okay. Is it a form, do you think? of the noun wabe, like the wabe upon which one might gyre, or alternatively gimble. That's what I'm thinking. But anyway, sorry. I'm thinking. I can't help but think of Alice. Alice is up next in Mythgard Academy. So I've had Jabberwocky on the brain. But anyway, okay. People who will see a world that I shall never know. Let's do it the other way around. Change it to shall. And what is it? This is a game that I like to play when I'm trying to figure out, like, what is the significance of that wording? I change it and see how it's different. And then you can compare and contrast the way it is and the way it isn't, right? And people who shall see a world that I shall never know. People who shall see a world that I shall never know. That's simpler, right? It's a dispassionate statement about the future. He is thinking about people. Which people? The people who are inescapably going to see a world that he inescapably shall not see, right? Similarly, if we change them both to wills, people who will see a world that I will never know. Would seem to differentiate them in terms of their wills. But again, I would introduce that sort of element of despair. I will never is a sad phrase, right? I will never. Sadder than I shall never. That's as may be, right? Yeah, Sarah, that's just the direction that I'm thinking. People will see. These are the people who are going to make an effort to go exploring and do as Bilbo has done. Yes. These people, the people he's referring to, the second people, right? People of line 3. We're doing the people backwards. The people of line 3 are the people who are going to do what he has done in stanzas 1 and 2, right? I sit beside the fire and think of all that I have seen, right? What lies in the future of the line 3 people from stanza 5? Meadow flowers and butterflies, probably. Maybe some yellow leaves and gossamer, right? Remember, the framework was all about the seeing, but the detached seeing, right? Yeah. That spectation. Now they're going to do it. He's not going to do it anymore, right? In this theoretical future time. But you're right, Sarah, that these are his heirs. He's not just saying, like, sooner or later, somebody's going to see this, right? It's a thing. It's going to be seen by somebody. No, he's talking about the people who will see that world as he has seen the world that he's been going through. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying it is looming future. I'm not saying it's theoretical. I'm not saying it's theoretical likely about. But I do think, yes, if I had to say that feels just right to me. If I had to summarize, what is the connection between, like, what is the force of will and shall there, especially of the will in line 3, it would be a link to Bilbo himself. Right? People who will see a world that I shall never know. On the one hand, it distinguishes him from them, right? In this future time, I shall not see it, but they will, right? They're going to choose it. Their volition will be set towards seeing that world. I shall not see it on account of I shall not be there, right? But they not only shall be able to see it, they will see it. So even though he's detaching himself from them, right, they are distinct in that those people will see and he shall not, right, which would make them seem almost like opposites, and yet there's that there's that connection. There's that almost inheritance, right? Yeah. And Bjorning, I do see your point about coming back to Estelle, especially if we think straight from what we were looking at in stanza 4 last time, and think about the hopefulness, right? In every wood and every spring there is a different green, right? And the way that we were linking that to, above all shadows rides the sun, right? Sam's insight in Mordor, both in the tower and later on, next to the thorn bushes, about the light and high beauty. If that is the kind of insight that Bilbo is having in stanza 4, then stanza 5, there's this sort of bequeathing it to them as far as in the world is concerned, right? That the world is going to go on without him is not a sad thought. It's not a despairing thought. Quite the reverse, in fact, right? And of course, that fits perfectly well with the trend that we have noticed to this point. It's never been about him, right? Why should it be about him now? Why should he be sad, considering a future that doesn't have him in it? He's spent the whole poem to this point considering a past that barely had him in it, right? A past which he was blessed enough to spectate, right? But it was never about him. Why should the future be about him, right? He's sitting there looking back at the past and thinking ahead about the future, but it was never about him. It's not going to be about those people either, but they will continue seeing that world. So once again, we come back to the seeing as that dominant idea throughout this whole poem. Sit beside sea, that I shall never know. Yeah. You can also say, we forgot the people long ago. At least I forgot the people long ago. And in that we can see Bilbo seeing a continuation, right? A sequence. There's him in the middle, in the present, right? And him looking back, and remember, this brings me back to mind of how we weren't always in the simple past before. We were in the present perfect, right? Thinking about the past, but thinking about the past that is ending in the present time, right? An action which is completed as of right now. He has always been positioned in that present point. And from that present point, he's been looking back at the autumns and the summers, and he's been looking forward at springs, thinking forward about springs, and the fact that he hasn't seen them, right? Then we get the people. And he's thinking first about people long ago, which presumably in that framework means people from before. He saw lots of autumns and lots of summers, but he wasn't the first one to see them. Presumably, there were people before him who also saw the yellow leaves and gossamer and saw the meadow flowers and butterflies and all of those things, right? And then he has seen them, and his seeing of them is coming to an end. Present perfect, right? I think, by the way, the present perfect might be the noblest tense for an elderly person to speak in, right? He's not lamenting. He's not repining. He's not desperately hoping for a future that may or may not come. The confidence of speaking in the present perfect, in the position like Bilbo is I think I like it a lot. But anyway, but then of course we know he's going to be in lines 3 and 4 there thinking about the future, right? The things that he shall not see, because present perfect, right? Present perfect is the tense that's standing in the present and looking back at the past. He's standing here and he's looking backwards. He can think about the future, but he can't know anything about the future, right? He shall never know that world, right? But he can think about the people who will see that world. Why? Because he knows some of them, those people who will see a world that he shall never know. There are some of them, like there are the people long ago, and they're going to be people long hence as well, right? People of the distant future who are not even born yet, that he doesn't know, who will also see a world that he shall never know. But there's also the people that he does know, that he can think about, right? Both the past people and the future people, but they're not exactly divided equally, you know? Not exactly divided equally, I mean between the past, future, and the future people. Past people and the future people. I think that, like, because the past people long ago, I take that as distant past. At least people who are already dead, right? People who are not in the present with him right now. But quite likely people even longer ago. At least it opens up the possibility that he's thinking about, you know, like Hurin and Beren and the other elf friends of old, right? Would be people long ago. But the future people, I think, are the people who are sort of adjacent to him in this way. And I agree, Connor, this poem is remarkably touching. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we may need a class session after the final stanza to consider the poem as a whole and within this context. Totally agree. I think we may still have 2 more weeks left on this poem. Speaking of which, it is super late. And I've not even really answered the question about knowing. We'll have to come back to that next time. So we didn't quite finish stanza 5. Well, it was close. Still more to see and to talk about. But yeah, we'll do stanza 6 next time, and then we'll see. We certainly have to return it to the context, because if you remember, The Lord of the Rings also contains prose. There was a bunch of prose that came before this poem. And I'm pretty sure that there's going to be a bunch of prose that's going to come after. And people who shall read a stanza that I shall never know. Yeah. Like the people long ago, meaning like the people that have died of old age while we've been discussing this poem. Yeah, it's also possible. Yeah, this book does have prose. I'm pretty sure that it has prose. And like, spoilers, but oh my goodness, look, there's prose right after the poem. But anyway, we'll get there. Anyway. All right. Thanks everybody for joining me. It's field trip. It's long past field trip time. So we will get, how long till the next poem? A ways, actually. It's going to be a bit, I think, until we get, isn't the next poem Gimli's poem? The Moria poem? A Khazad-dûm poem? I think so. Yeah, Drow-Snake, that was my memory too. I don't think there are any other poems before that one. Yeah, Drow-Snake, that will be a quick class. I'm sure we'll rip through that one pretty quickly. People who will make it to the appendices that I shall never know. Yeah, that's also very, very possible. Okay, thanks everybody. We're going to shift, as I have said. Good evening, Valori. Field trip time.
Good
long
evening.
past field trip time. Sorry. So we'll do it. We'll do a shortish field trip. I know that one of the consequences of doing the what is going on here? Stop with stupid notifications, Windows. One of the consequences of doing poetry is it's like shortchanging our field trips, but
We'll make do, I suppose.
We'll make do. We'll make do. Okay, so but we have a goal. It's a relatively simple goal tonight. So let's go back to Echad Dunan. That little way station customs house next to Moria, and we will. So I'm going to milestone over there, and then we're going to get to Mirabel. Like the goal is just to get to Mirabel, and find the milestone there, and we'll try not to go too deep into detail there. We'll just kind of look about us and make some plans for what we'll look at and talk about in future, but. I think getting there, and the first leg of the road we've already done the other direction, so it should be relatively easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just taking.
Right. Yeah,
Looks
and
like
the fact
balanced,
that it's the middle of the night feels perfectly apt. Like feels like
under the stars and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just like that, we're really late starting up. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Let us head down the road. So,
all right.
We're now doing this ride from the Moria perspective. So we have emerged from dwarf lands and we immediately find that customs house, way station, refreshment area, gift shop. And now we've got the triumphal arches. So we, the elves, are trying to signal to the dwarves like, hey, you're in elf terrain now. And we believe in like open, but beautiful things, right? We're not, you're definitively not underground. But you're, that would be interesting, wouldn't it? If like the kind of archways that we have are designed to be like, hey, it's like you're out here above ground, our dwarf friends, but you're like kind of tunneling, right? It's like you're going to go through arches. You're going to go through little tunnels.
Sort of the opposite of the pillars carved to look like trees.
Yeah, exactly. Helping their, underground, their subterranean friends to feel more comfortable up here above ground. Not that but they're not going to like make a whole tunnel, right? They're not going to, because that would be walling out the sun and the air and all of the beauty, right?
Yeah. I don't think the dwarves get the bends if they come out from underground too.
Right. No, exactly. But okay, so now we're coming down very close to the beautiful bubbling river, right? But I'm thinking here, so that's Tralalali land up there, isn't it? Yes, it is. So we just passed, as I thought, the intersection, right? So this is where you go north to other elvish pleasure parks. So the trip up to Tralalali land is not a long one if you want to make a nice, pleasant detour. Was there a ford here? The road doesn't continue south, does it? No, it does not. So at least not according to the map. Okay, so I'm just wanting to make sure if this was a 3 or 4-way.
You keep going in this direction, you go to Enidwith.
Right. Yeah. That's you. But I'm like, I don't think there was any original road there. Is what I mean.
No, I don't.
So again,
think so.
Thinking from the Eregion standpoint, from the Celebrimbor frame of mind here. Okay. So
Does it look like it is confirmed the next poem is Gimli's?
Okay. Yeah, it is. There we go. That's what I thought. I was pretty sure. That's going to be a fascinating one because we're going to have to compare it and contrast it with its source. So, but you're right, Drow Snake, because I'm in a Celebrimborian state of mind. That's exactly, you're right. We should seize the opportunity to use the adjective. Okay. All right. So we're still going along the river. We've got these boulders. Now, I haven't seen any, since we left, like, the arches there, I have not seen any evidence of any other construction.
Yes.
I keep swinging around looking north because I'm looking for any, like, bits of ruins or anything. Like we saw some slightly off the path before.
Yeah, only across the river on top of that big hill up there.
Right, yeah. Right, up over there. And that seems close to the city, probably, right? That's probably,
I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, an extension of the city. So, okay, now there's our first thing off to the right. But this, I think we're now entering Low Holland. Yeah, we're
Yeah, we're near Pember, aren't we?
This is the suburbs. What we're seeing over
yeah.
here on the right is presumably the suburbs. Okay, so, but I'm going to resist the temptation to explore it more fully because that's not our goal tonight, because it's super late and we're just going to get our initial lay of the land and we're going to find the milestone and then we shall resume. Now we get a huge towering bridge over here. I have to turn off my light because I can't see anything on the screen when it's nighttime. And okay, so we're gonna come up and having ridden right alongside this river all the way down from Moria, from the gates of Moria, really. We now sweep across this bridge, which I'm going to be interested to compare and contrast this bridge to the one in Tralalalaliland.
Yeah, I was going to say it seems to have that.
Okay, now we've got another pillars with that trellis between them. So we've got now buildings on either side. So once we cross the river, we're in town, more or less. Yes. Okay, and we've got, let's see, anything over there? I'm not seeing too much, but there might be. Hang on, I'm trying to like look either side while I'm riding straight, and that's just not a winning proposition here. Okay. All right, so now we come up upon, all right, well, we've got a path going up onto the hill to the left, which is interesting. So we got, the road brings us to one of two destinations, either up the stairs to those towers on the hill, or over yet another sweeping bridge back across the river.
Into a mission.
Into a mission. We can't get into this?
Instance.
Nope, I don't have a corresponding quest. All right. Yep. So I guess it's otherwise we go then, right?
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Oh, no, wait, that's a different river? Okay, sorry, I was losing my sense of geography here. Okay.
Yeah, different
We've
river.
Got another choice.
This one has water in it.
Right. Oh, yeah, it did have water in it. Of course, I was seeing the waterfall and not noticing that the river with the waterfall had water and the river was a dry bed did not. Okay, so we've got another division once we've come up the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
But let's keep going up the slope, I think.
Oh, this is very reminiscent of Eregion.
Yes. Okay.
Oh, I want to look at the music later. Later.
Oh man, there's a lot here. Okay, so I've got the stable master. Is there a milestone?
I don't know if there is a milestone. There is a campsite, but that only helps some of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if there's a milestone. It's upstairs?
What was that? Oh, it's upstairs? Okay.
If there is one, there is one up here.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, okay. Not looking.
Well done.
Not looking. Okay, Gwen, keep going. Found the stable master. I feel like I've ridden off that cliff. I just did the hairpin turn on several times in the past.
Oh, whoa.
Oh, here we go. Okay. Oh, man.
I know. It's gorgeous up here.
All right. Okay, this is really interesting.
Yeah, you're going to have to finish that at a reasonable time next week so we can look at this. This is
maybe
cool.
So. Okay, there's a lot. Maybe we just not get outside this room next time. Okay. All right. The milestone. Excellent.
Quite
okay.
likely.
Very good. Okay, so here we are. And just looking at the beautiful stonework around us, but instead looking out. Where are we? We are... I can't tell anything because I'm looking at tree
overlooking the
branches.
river, I think.
Okay, so there we're looking down on... What direction am I facing? West? Okay. Right, so there's the other river, the one with actual water in it, which can be seen from here, and that other place across the river that we couldn't go to. And then north we can see... Oh, what's that? That's... We'll have to see. And... Oh, that's the Gwathlo, right? Of course, the Gwathlo. How could I forget the Gwathlo? The Gwathlo is a very important river. Okay. All right. Have my bearings now. Okay. All right. So we have found Mirabel. This is, of course, a place that Tolkien never describes or talks about in any detail whatsoever. But it is the theoretical capital of Celebrimbor, the center of all of the Celebrimborian activity of the Second Age here in the Kingdom of Eregion. Okay, all right. So we will look around here and see, having seen the rest, almost all of the rest of Elvish Eregion, checking out this and seeing what we see, both in terms of similarities and different. Exactly, the heart of Celebrimbordom on Earth. That's fantastic. Celebrimbordom is excellent.
Do my boy dirty like that.
No. It's not an insult. It's a special kind of boredom. But no, I'm kidding. Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, all right, very good. We will start here next time. Now that we've found our way, and I'm particularly interested by the rivers, and so it's at the confluence of the two rivers, the one river and the one non-river, of course,
The river and the river that is not a river.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to be thinking about. Again, I want to think about the dwarven visitors, but not only the dwarven visitors, the elven visitors, and what are we getting? Anyway, much to think about in this area. I think we'll be here for a while, even longer than we'll be here finishing the rest of the poem. But anyway, I will leave it after a brief excursion here tonight, and we shall pick it. Now was certainly not the time to begin an exploration in detail of Mirabel. So we will start here next week. Thank you very much for joining us, as always, and I will see you guys next week for the end of the poem, if not perhaps necessarily the conclusion of our discussion thereof. Thanks, everybody. Good night now.
Bye.